I can't believe they let him on this flight. The voice was quiet, but it was still enough for me to hear. It came from behind me, from a woman sitting just a few rows away. I tried to ignore it, but something in her tone made my spine stiffen. It was a normal flight. The usual hum of the engines, the chatter of passengers settling in, the steady rhythm of the attendants walking up and down the aisles. But there was something off in the air. Maybe it was the way the woman's words lingered, sharp and calculated. Maybe it was the sudden heaviness in the air around me. Whatever it was, it made my chest tighten, my palms sweat. I shifted in my seat, adjusting the collar of my jacket to hide the tension I could feel building in my shoulders. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Something that would change everything. Across the aisle, the woman's eyes were on me again, glaring with a cold intensity. Every glance was accompanied by a muttered comment, just loud enough for me to hear. What's he doing here? Shouldn't he be in the back with the rest of them? I clenched my jaw, but kept my gaze straight ahead. I wasn't about to let her see me react, but I couldn't ignore the weight of her words, each one falling like a stone in my gut. Then it happened again, louder this time. I don't want him near me. Someone should do something. Her words were sharp, almost like a knife cutting through the air. I looked around, but no one seemed to be paying attention. The flight attendants were moving down the aisles, none of them acknowledging the tension that had started to rise. I could feel her eyes boring into me, each second of her stare a reminder of what she thought of me. And I was sure, with each passing moment, that things were about to escalate. She was looking for an ally, someone to back her up, someone to get me removed from the flight. I had been here before. The sideways glances, the whispers behind my back, the quiet judgments. It was a familiar feeling one I had grown used to over the years. But this time, something felt different. I felt her hostility as it grew, feeding off the reactions of others around her. And in that moment, I knew she wasn't just upset, she was about to make a move. The tension in the cabin built slowly, creeping up until it seemed to fill every corner of the plane. My heart began to race, but I kept my eyes straight ahead. I couldn't let her see how much her words were getting to me. I wasn't the kind of person who let it show, especially not when I knew exactly what was happening. But this time it was different. This time, it wasn't just the typical racism I had dealt with before. This time, it was deliberate. And as the plane continued to cruise through the skies, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to be dragged into something much bigger than I could imagine. The flight continued with a quiet unease. The woman had stopped speaking aloud, but her eyes never left me. Every time I looked up, she was there, watching, waiting. I could feel the weight of her gaze, as though she was trying to make me uncomfortable on purpose. It was working. I tried to refocus on my book, but the words blurred together as my mind raced. Every muscle in my body was tense, but I refused to let her see how much she was getting to me. She had made it clear that she didn't think I belonged here. Her mutterings had grown more frequent, and I could tell she was trying to rally others to her side, her words casting a dark shadow over the flight. I glanced at the crew. The flight attendants moved efficiently, but there was something different about the way they carried themselves. They seemed distracted, their eyes occasionally darting in my direction, as though they were waiting for something. A quiet exchange passed between two of them as they passed my row, and one of them looked at me with an apologetic glance. I knew exactly what that look meant. It was the same look people gave when they knew something wasn't right, but were too scared to step in. Suddenly, the woman stood up. She made her way down the aisle with a certain purpose, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. She didn't look at me as she passed, but I could feel the tension in the air intensify. It was like everything had come to a head in that moment. I could almost hear the quiet murmurs around the cabin grow louder, their subtle whispers turning into something more noticeable. She reached the back of the plane and spoke to one of the flight attendants. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I saw her hand gestures, sharp and insistent. Her body language screamed that she was demanding something that I was sure had to do with me. I held my breath, the tension in my chest growing with each passing second. Something was about to happen. I could feel in my gut. The crew had to do something. She was asking for action, and I was sure I wasn't going to like what that action would be. Moments later, the woman returned to her seat, her eyes flicking over to me with a look of satisfaction. I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to know what was going on. My body was screaming to take control of the situation, to stand up and confront her, but I stayed in my seat, my fingers tightening around the armrests. The last thing I wanted was to escalate things, but I couldn't just sit there in silence, either. It wasn't long before the flight attendant reappeared, but this time, he wasn't alone. He was flanked by one of the officers I had seen earlier at the terminal. I noticed them walking through the gate when we boarded, but I hadn't thought much of it. But now, seeing them approach, I felt a chill run through me. The officer's gaze met mine, but he didn't speak. He simply motioned for me to stand. The flight attendant, standing a few paces behind, looked uncomfortable, as if he knew what was about to happen but didn't want to get involved. "Sir," the officer said, his voice cold and authoritative, "I'm going to need you to follow me." I could feel the eyes of every passenger on me now. Their gazes burned into my back, some curious, some judging, and some with the unmistakable sense that they knew exactly what was happening. The woman across the aisle smiled faintly, a victory in her eyes. I stood up, but before I could take a step, something unexpected happened. A voice rang out, calm but commanding, from the back of the plane. "Excuse me, officer." It was a man's voice, deep, firm, with an edge of authority that cut through the air. Everyone in the cabin froze. The officer turned, and I felt a shift in the atmosphere. The officer, who had been prepared to escort me off the plane, seemed taken aback. The man who had spoken stood at the rear of the plane, his posture straight, his demeanor cool and controlled. He wasn't just a passenger. There was something about him, something that made the entire cabin feel suddenly smaller. "I believe there's been a mistake," the man continued, his eyes locked on the officer's. There was an unspoken tension between them. The officer hesitated, his hand still at his side. "Sir, you're going to have to remain seated." But the man took a step forward, his jacket shifting just enough for me to see what he pulled from beneath it. The unmistakable glint of a badge. Not just any badge. An FBI badge. The room went silent. "FBI," he said firmly. "I'm taking over this situation. Step aside." The officer's face drained of color, his posture faltering for a split second. He took a step back, clearly surprised and uncertain about what to do next. The flight attendants, who had been so involved in the chaos moments earlier, were now standing still, as if waiting for further orders. I felt the weight of the moment press down on me. The woman, the one who had instigated it all, now looked stunned. Her eyes darted from the officer to the man with the badge, her confidence evaporating as quickly as it had appeared. The FBI agent turned to me, his expression softening just enough for me to see a flicker of reassurance in his eyes. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice a calming presence in the middle of the storm. The cabin remained still, the air thick with confusion and a strange sense of relief. For a moment, the chaos paused, and all eyes turned to the man who had just revealed himself as an FBI agent. His presence alone had completely shifted the atmosphere. The officer, who had moments ago been poised to remove me from the flight, now stood motionless, uncertain. The woman who had been so vocal in her disdain for me seemed completely thrown off. Her previous confidence had drained from her face, replaced by an expression of disbelief and frustration. She stared at the agent, clearly unsure how to respond. "You can't just come in here and," she started, but her words faltered when the agent raised a hand. "I can and I will," he interrupted calmly. "This situation is under control now, and you, ma'am, are going to need to explain yourself." The woman's face reddened, but she remained silent. The agent turned his attention back to me, his voice softening. "Are you all right, sir?" I nodded, still processing everything that had just happened. "Yeah, I think so. But what is going on? What was she trying to do?" The agent gave a brief, almost imperceptible nod. "The woman you're dealing with is part of a much bigger issue. A political conspiracy that's been targeting certain individuals for some time. You were just in the wrong place at the wrong time." I felt my stomach turn. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. A conspiracy? What kind of conspiracy? The agent hesitated for a moment, clearly weighing how much to reveal. "I can't go into the details, but what I can tell you is that this flight this route was meant to transport certain individuals. Your seat, the one you thought was a mistake, it wasn't a mistake. You were targeted. My mind reeled. Targeted? For what? Before I could speak, the agent's phone buzzed. He pulled it out of his pocket and glanced at the screen. A brief frown crossed his face. I have to step out for a moment, he said. And then, as though reading my mind, he added, don't worry. We're handling this. I watched as he moved toward the front of the plane, leaving the woman, still seated, to stew in her frustration. The officer who had been standing by awkwardly shifted his position, clearly unsure of how to proceed now that the situation had completely changed. I stood frozen in place, my heart still racing as everything settled into an uneasy calm. I couldn't understand how all of this had spiraled out of control so quickly. What was her goal? Why me? A few moments passed in silence before the woman stood up, her eyes darting toward the rear of the plane where the agent had just disappeared. She made a sharp movement to the aisle, but before she could take a step, I spoke. Why? I asked, my voice low but firm. Why go after me? What is it that you want? She didn't answer right away, and for a moment, I thought she might ignore me completely. But then, she turned to face me, her eyes no longer filled with venom, but with something I couldn't quite place. You have no idea what you're involved in, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. It's bigger than you think. We try to handle it without getting you caught in the middle, but I guess we miscalculated. Miscalculated? I repeated, shaking my head. How could you miscalculate this? You've been plotting to have me removed from this flight because of some political game I wasn't even aware of. She sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. You were meant to be part of something much bigger, something that I didn't want you to be involved in. The people behind all of this have been pulling the strings. They wanted you off this flight to prevent a meeting from happening. And that meeting, well, you'll find out soon enough. But don't worry. It's over now. Before I could press her further, the agent returned, his expression calm but serious. Everything's in hand, he said, addressing the woman directly. We've contacted the necessary parties. You'll be escorted off the plane when we land, and we'll deal with this from there. The woman didn't respond, but the look in her eyes told me she knew her time was up. She turned away without another word, sitting back down in her seat. The tension in the air was palpable, but it felt like the storm was passing. The agent moved to the front once more, his presence a silent reassurance that everything was under control. As the plane continued on its path, I sat back in my seat, still processing what had just happened. The revelation about the conspiracy, the woman's involvement, and the FBI agent's intervention, it all felt surreal, like a nightmare that was finally beginning to make sense. I glanced at the passengers around me. Most were still unaware of the drama that had just unfolded. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of the story. It had only just begun.